Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and I am the President and Chairperson Board of Director of ICHRRF. We have started our seminar series for the fellowship training program, which is named as Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and the executive team of the ICHRRF, I invite all our audience members for yet another seminar in the ICHRRF Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program. Our distinguished faculty for this fellowship training program is headed by Professor Ved P. Nanda. We also have Professor Yashwant Pathak, Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, Mr. Carl Clements, Mr. Hardam Tripathi, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, Professor Nidhi Shandurkar, and Dr. Richard Benkin. Currently, we have two fellows. Our first fellow is Mr. Repudaman Pachori, who joined us in January of 2022. And we have a second fellow who joined us in the beginning of month of July, Mrs. Anushree Ghisad, who joined the July 2022 batch. Our fellowship training program has a standard format. Initial 25 to 30 minutes presentation is by the fellow who does the review of literature. This is followed by 10 minutes commentary by our chief mentor, Professor Ved Nanda, and that is followed by 25 minutes of discussion by the faculty preceptor for that particular seminar. In this case, we have Professor Nanda as chief mentor as well as faculty preceptor. So he'll have ample of time to give his comments because he's intimately involved with the evolution of human rights in the international arena. Last 30 minutes are for questions and answers. So the topic for today's seminar is International Covenants on Human Rights and International Treaties. And Anushree Ghisad would be presenting this one. Besides that, we are seeking applications for our January 2023 session. Also, hopefully by end of this month, we will release our special hearing report on Kashmiri Hindu genocide. We are also inviting volunteer faculty members. If anyone is interested, if anyone knows of other people who want to join as faculty preceptors, we'll be very happy to talk to those people. Some housekeeping rules: kindly keep yourself on mute to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. Please do not try to interrupt either our fellow or our esteemed faculty preceptor when they are speaking. Questions are done in the last 30 minutes using Q&A session, and we generally ask you to put your questions through chat function. Since it may be a small group, we might make an exception today. If we have a large audience, then we will use the chat function. Please be precise in asking the questions. Please don't give a monologue or a lecture in the form of a question. Lastly, this session is being recorded and it will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel within next 24 hours. And without further ado, I invite our fellow Mrs. Anushree Ghisad to give her presentation. Anushree, you are on mute. Kindly unmute yourself and you can share your screen now, anytime during your presentation.
Namaskar Adityanji, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So, thank you very much Adityanji. And thank you one and all for selecting me for this prestigious fellowship. This would be my maiden presentation. And the topic for my presentation, as Adityanji has already said, is International Covenants of Human Rights and International Treaties. So my presentation is basically based on my rudimentary understanding of this topic, and I received guidance of Professor Ved Nanda ji also. So I have taken his suggestions and incorporated his feedback. So at the very onset, let me give you a brief layout how I propose to begin. Initially, I would be shedding some light on genesis of human rights. Then we would be talking about the anomalies that exist in human rights, as in theory and in practice. Then we would be speaking on evolution of international covenants, specifically the United Nations Charter of 1946. Then we would speak about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Then we will also talk about the International Bill of Rights. And this bill constitutes two major covenants. So we are going to cover that also. Other than that, evolution of major conventions of human rights, that we will see. Then we will do some critical assessment of these existing conventions, followed by which we will try to shed some light on R2P, or the responsibility to protect, which is a newly emerged concepts in the human rights movement. Lastly, we would also speak on the United Nations Human Rights Council, and then we will also touch upon the new dimensions of human rights movement. So with that, I begin my presentation. So what basically are the human rights? So these are some basic fundamental rights which are given to every human being just by virtue of them being human beings. So they are rights because they are things you are allowed to be, to do, or even to have. Now, since this presentation is my understanding of the given subject matter, my understanding of human rights stems from the culture that I come from, which is why I thought it would be prudent to touch upon some part of human rights evolution in Indian civilization also. So the quest for equilibrium, harmony, knowledge, and truth inspired the ancient Indian minds more than their other Western counterparts. About 5,000 years ago, ancient Indian rishis, they expounded a theory of higher moral law over and above positive law, embodying certain values of universal validity, such as dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. Their view was to establish a harmonious social order. And how they proposed to do that? By striking a balance between inner and outer, spiritual and material aspects of life. The philosophers of Vedic age had a very strong conviction that human rights are universal and they apply to all people without any discrimination. So the ancient Indian legal philosophers were universalists, humanists, rationalists, and above all, they were moralists who evolved a system of legal theory which was based on higher values and ideals. So the most significant declaration on human rights come from Shanti Parva of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It states, Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani paschantu ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet. It essentially speaks of human rights of every individual and how my human rights are deeply interwoven with human rights with anybody else on this planet. And this is not just confined to human rights as evolved in Indian civilization. Even in the Enlightenment era, prominent thinkers like John Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, they have expounded a lot on human rights. They have usually described it as something which is universal in nature, not contingent upon laws, customs, beliefs of any particular culture or government. Even the concept of natural rights features prominently in American Revolution and also in the French Revolution. American Declaration of Independence and French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen are essentially human rights documents. So you can see that the United States Declaration of Independence of 1776 goes on to say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So the point being, human rights are foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And denial of human rights to any individual is not only tragic for that particular individual, but it also creates a condition of social and political unrest, or even violence or conflict within the societies and even within the countries. Which is why protection of human rights of an individual and also of an society is of utmost importance. Now, having said that, we do see brazen violation of human rights in the world around us. So the concept of human rights is essentially pre-World War construct, but the human right movement is a post-Second World War phenomena. We have seen blatant silence on human rights abuse during colonization, slave trade, during religious fanaticism. But the last nail in the coffin was that of the Holocaust during World War II. And the global human rights movement was a direct reaction to these horrors and injustices perpetrated during the World War II. And that is when the entire global community came together and gave this clarion call of never again. Hence arose a need for an institutional mechanism for the human rights. And that is how we have the United Nations Charter of 1945, which was a direct outcome of World War II. It is in this charter that it establishes a direct link between the international peace and human rights. So as you can see, the second goal embedded in the preamble of the United Nations Charter goes on to say that to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. Even the Article 1 of this charter goes on to state that the purpose of the United Nations is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms of all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Just to give you a quick outlet as to how the UN structure for protection and promotion of human rights operates, we have United Nations Human Rights Council, we have United Nations Treaty Body, then there is International Criminal Court, and then there are regional human rights regimes. 3 years later, what we see is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the United Nations drafted an instrument which enumerated basic human rights, and that instrument has culminated into Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This UDHR is called as the milestone document in the history of human rights. Now, why are we calling it a milestone? Because earlier in the United Nations Charter, there was no provision on protection of human rights. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights specifies civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. The declaration was adopted by the General Assembly as a resolution. Now, what does it mean that General Assembly has adopted it as a resolution? It means that the rights enshrined in the declaration are not binding on the member states. So they are more like the directive principle of state policies that we have in the Indian Constitution. It was drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from different regions of the world. This declaration was proclaimed on December 10, 1948. But since the rights enshrined in this declaration were not binding on the member states, hence the next step was to codify these rights in the form of a treaty, or rather in the form of various treaties. So we see that with the passage of time, the ambit of human rights was further widened. 7 major human rights treaties are enlisted over here. I will just quickly go through them. International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, Convention against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, Convention on Rights of the Children, International Convention on Protection of Rights of all migrant workers and members of their families. Now, if you could see the time frame of adoption of these treaties, it is worth noting that no major convention was adopted in 1950s or till mid 1960s. No, that is because because of the geopolitical realities of that time, the ongoing tussle between the two major blocs of the world during the Cold War, it in a way relegated any discussion around human rights secondary. So by 1966, the member states agreed on two separate conventions. These were International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, these two covenants, along with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it constituted the International Bill of Rights, which was adopted in 1976. And this bill is of great consequence. But before getting into that, I will like to shed some light on these two individual covenants. So, the first covenant, it deals with the human rights such as freedom of movement, equality before law, the right to a fair trial and presumption of innocence, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, participation in public affairs and elections, and protection of minority rights. Now, this is about the freedom that is enshrined, but there are certain prohibitions also. Prohibitions against warmongering, prohibitions against racial discrimination, and so on and so forth. Coming to the second covenant, the human rights that the second covenant seeks to promote and protect include right to work in just and favorable conditions, right to social protection, to an adequate standard of living, and to the highest attainable standards of physical and mental well-being, the right to education and enjoyment of benefits of cultural freedom and scientific progress. The slide is not moving. It has moved. So why this bill of 1976 is important? It is important because it has far-reaching consequences. Post 1976, we see great strides in the development of international human rights law. Numerous international agreements were created. Most important of all, there was pressure on member states for implementation of treaty obligations. And the most remarkable achievement of this bill was the establishment of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, this office itself is a part of the United Nations Secretariat. It acts as the principal focal point of human rights research, education, public information, and human rights advocacy activities. It offers leadership in educating and empowering individuals and assisting states in upholding human rights and supports the work of the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism. Equally important, it promotes both the universal ratification as well as the implementation of major human rights treaties and respect for the rule of law. It also ensures enforcement of universally recognized human rights norms. Having said that, the conventions that we have seen so far, they are not free from criticism. The major criticism that they have deals with the overall culture of impunity that was seen. Also the culture of confrontation and distrust. And above all, there was a tendency to selectively cast aside a few countries and selectively condemn them. For instance, Israel was pointed out time and again, and heavy criticism on Israel in a way undermined the credibility of entire institution. Owing to this, and owing to some other developments of the 20th century and even 21st century, where there was blatant disregard to human rights norm, the concept of R2P, or the responsibility to protect, came into being. Now, the backdrop of that is the Holocaust or the genocide in Cambodia, in Rwanda, or the crime against humanity in, say, former Yugoslavia, East Timor, Sri Lanka, Darfur, or even Syria. It demonstrates that the extreme failure by the international community to respond to the threats of atrocities and crime. So, responsibility to protect is an emerging international norm. Contemporary crises have challenged world leaders with complex choices regarding when and how they should act to protect population abroad and live up to the conventions and the laws which they are signatories. So, responsibility to protect, or as it is said, R2P, it seeks to clarify where responsibility lies and to provide guidance on what sort of action should be taken to prevent these crimes from taking place or even from escalating. So basically, R2P establishes that the protection of people from these crimes lies with the state itself. The core principle of this is that all states have a responsibility to protect their people. However, not all states are able to or even willing to uphold this responsibility all the time. Sometimes they need help, encouragement, or even more forceful intervention. Therefore, responsibility to protect assigns additional responsibilities to the international community. And when we say international community, it means member states as well as international and regional organizations and non-governmental organizations also. R2P holds that this international community has a responsibility to assist other countries in upholding their responsibility, and should states be unwilling to protect their people or unable to act upon it. So for R2P, it is implemented by using diplomatic, humanitarian, and even other peaceful means. Stronger measures like enforced sanction or the use of military force authorized by the United Nations Security Council can also be exercised. So basically, there are three pillars of responsibility. Responsibility that of a state, responsibility that of the international community to assist, and responsibility of international community to take decisive action should a state fail to protect. Coming to United Nations Human Rights Commission, its formation itself was considered to be a major achievement. It was formed to replace the Human Rights Council. It was formed to replace the United Nations Human Rights Commission. In establishing the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly enhanced Commission status by creating it as a subsidiary organ of the Assembly, instead of being a subsidiary body of the Economic and Social Council. So one of its features is that it is smaller in size, meaning it comprises 47 members, and it is elected directly by majority vote of the General Assembly. Also, the most innovative feature is the Universal Periodic Review. It means all the member states which are involved, they would be reviewed for their personal human rights. And the guiding principles are universality, impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, constructive international dialogue, and cooperation. Coming to the last part of our presentation, the spectrum of human rights is again further widening. So the entire human rights movement has come up to include many issues of the new times. Some of these issues include dispossession of traditional lands, inherent rights derived from spiritual traditions, culture and traditions of indigenous people, rights of people with different sexual orientations, rights of reproductive health. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Electricity at my end has suddenly been cut off. Nevertheless, right to reproductive health, right to natural resources, and also right to historic truth. So in conclusion, what we see is that Progressive changes have taken place with the international communities focusing sharper attention on international human rights issues around the world. The creation of essential norms as well as the implementation machinery is a laudable achievement. Nevertheless, challenge lies in the implementation and enforcement of these norms by the member states because that remains the unfinished agenda. With that, I have come to the end of my presentation. Dhanyavad.
Anushree, please stop sharing your screen.
Yes, Adityanji. I'm just wondering how to do that.
You go
Yes,
on your
that I
dashboard.
see the option.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much indeed for such a comprehensive review of the human rights treaties and covenants. And I'm pretty sure we are going to have a lot of discussion. So I'm going to invite our chief mentor and your preceptor for this seminar, Professor Nanda, to give his comments. And I think we have enough time. So, Professor Nanda, the floor is yours now, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Adityanji. You have done wonderful work. Anushree, I thought, as I mentioned to you, it was pretty comprehensive, thorough work. Couple items that I might ask you to kindly give special attention. And one would be that, as you articulated beautifully, the history of the evolution of human rights movement currently after the Second World War. But then you also mentioned that historically, if you go back in the Vedic literature 5,000, 10,000 years ago, you had those very universal values and kind of inalienable rights that human beings have just by the nature and by the reason of being human. So the first item that I want you to think about is, why do we have two covenants? Because as you mentioned, the International Bill of Rights, there is the Universal Declaration. Universal Declaration, non-binding. Simply, it's standard for achievement and a standard that countries should follow. But after that declaration, you appropriately said that what intervened was the Cold War. And what resulted was that there was no treaty until almost 20 years. It was 48 and then 76. And it took a long time with 65. And the reason for that simply was that the United States and the Western countries, remember, their focus always has been on just civil and political rights. The focus is not on economic, social, and cultural rights. In the US Constitution, there is not a single thing about any right that you have. What you have is freedom from any oppression by the state. And that is what has happened for many, many years. Soviet Union at that time is the one that talked about economic rights. United States wanted civil and political rights, the West. And there was no meeting of the mind. And finally, the thought was that instead of one treaty, that they would like to have then two treaties. And here the difference is enormous because civil and political rights covenant, as you know, is justiciable. You can go to a court of law and you can say that as a human being, I have got a right not to be detained without giving me charges. I have a right not to be tortured. But then you don't have a right that can be taken to the court and say, I have a right to education. I have a right to food. I have a right to any of these economic, social, and cultural aspects. They are not justiciable because the treaty says, the covenant says, that you've got to have progressive realization of those rights, that it depends upon your own capacity, that the best of your ability, you are to implement them, but that they are not justiciable as civil and political rights. And then I think you're absolutely right in saying that today there are so many treaties. And you implicitly mentioned that there are three things that happened in the current evolution of human rights. One, you have got norms, that there are laws now. You can't torture. You can't do what happened during the apartheid time. You have the right of disabled people. You have the right of women, because you have to say that you must not treat women, and you must have implicitly empowerment of women, gender equality, all that comes in under that treaty that simply says that do not discriminate of any kind against women. You've got the right of the child. So there are all these rights. Then secondly, you've got institutions. Most of these treaties have got their committees that are going to enforce. Those committees then have third part to it, processes. They've got procedures. So norms, institutions, processes. You can simply remember that NIP, that these three parts in all these treaties are there. And then you finally appropriately said that today, implementation, enforcement, this is the unfinished agenda. And here I think implicitly you also said that the reason for all that is that at the present time, 193 countries, they are just like prima donnas. They have got to give consent in order to be bound by anything. And then you used R2P, but remember, it's an exceptionally good new norm evolving. And the reason for that was, as you probably saw that, heard that, looked into, and kindly do pay it special attention, that what happened is that Kofi Annan, he, on his watch happened Rwanda. On his watch happened in the middle of Europe and all that burning, Serbs and Croatians and Muslims, and all that setting, and nothing could be done. And he simply said, look, when you need to do something, the international community doesn't. Otherwise, they take unilateral action. And he said, shouldn't we have changed all that humanitarian intervention instead of saying that each country doesn't have the right to intervene, but it has got duty to protect. So that change happened. But please, again, look into it, that wonderful idea, but there is nothing that has happened. Syria is there, Yemen is there, today Ukraine is there, and nothing is going to happen because of the Security Council and its veto. And currently what's happening is that there is an effort at the United Nations General Assembly this year, that there is one item that you might keep in mind. This is the General Assembly's role on issues of war and peace. When you think of peace and security, international peace and security, that they might be the ones who ought to have residual power of the General Assembly. And what it really means is that if the Security Council is not able to act, then maybe General Assembly ought to do something. It cannot act because the charter doesn't permit it to act, but it can make recommendations. And maybe it ought to be able to do that if the Security Council is not looking into that area. And that is where the difficulty lies at the present time, because these major powers, they are all the time willing to do veto. On Syria, 14, 15 resolutions, all of them vetoed. Resolution even providing humanitarian aid and providing some kind of avenue to provide that aid, even that vetoed. So at the present time, there is effort at the United Nations to give some kind of responsibility to the General Assembly. But General Assembly cannot act. So the thought simply is that if these veto-wielding powers will not, on their own, simply recuse themselves if they have got three things: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. These are the atrocity crimes. That on these issues, if they have got their own interest, can they recuse themselves? Can they say that they are not going to use veto on any of these things if they are involved in it? So there is a great deal of effort. And finally, I simply want you to know that the latest change, last October 2021, there is for the first time a resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council that there is a human right to the environment, that clean, that uh, that the environment that is necessary, that there is a human right to it. And this year, coming September, in the General Assembly, they would like to adopt a resolution. And there are 4 countries that said no to it initially. Initially, they simply abstained. This is Russia, China, and along with that, India. United States didn't, because they were also going to do that. And so that is the latest kind of development on human rights and the environment. I'm going to stop here. As you continue your own study, I'll be delighted to talk with you and delighted to assist you. I'll be teaching this semester again international human rights law. I have permitted 12 PhD and MS students, and I have 12. I usually take 12 law students, masters, and JD. But this year I've got 14 on the waiting list from the law school. I might take those. And so it'll be a good group of about 30, 40, both PhD, MA, and law students and master's students. So during this time, I'll be teaching that. And if you would like to come sometime in the class also, I would permit you to do that. And I hope that they'll have the Zoom also open, because if it's in person, then obviously it'll be hard. So happy to have you as a fellow. And today's work was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Nanda. As usual, you know, you summarize everything with such a clarity, the historical aspects, the current challenges, because of your continued involvement over last 4 or 5 decades about human rights, international human rights. Uh, Anushree, just for sake of information, Professor Nanda, in Professor Nanda's name, there's a Center for Human Rights at University of Denver. So we have a very illustrious mentor uh, who can, guide us in this field. And my hope is that all our fellows, current as well as future, will continue to get benefit from Professor Nanda's scholarship, wisdom, and erudition. He is a leading light in the field of human rights.
Adityanji is very kind. As you know, I'm a student of human rights. Each year, I learn a whole lot more, try to have at least some understanding of it. And I think gradually I am reaching a point where I am a good student now.
That's your humility, sir. We are a very small group. I saw that,
Thank you.
we have only 8 participants today. So I think we can have some time for good discussion. And I'll encourage people to give their comments and, ask questions to either Anushree or Professor Nanda. I'm sure both will be happy to answer questions. I just want to make one observation, Anushree. You did say that, there are some challenges and there are some shortcomings. And, you know, you did mention about U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. And you started with, that was essentially human rights rather than anything else. And you quoted the famous line, all men are created equal. Now, if we see the reality, what is in the text and what is actual practice, it basically means all white men are created equal, because the founders of American Constitution and American Republic, they were slave owners, they were very active slave owners, and they indulged in genocide of a native population without batting an eyelid and without having any iota of guilt. There was no mention of all human beings are equal, all men are equal, that automatically rejected all women. They did not have actually right to vote until very late. In fact, uh, finally the universal suffrage came in 50s only. So when we look at some of these high and mighty declarations, we really need to look into the socio-economic, cultural, and geopolitical context in which these documents are written. And the same goes for the international covenants and human rights treaties. We talk about rights of minorities. There are countries that are signatory to all United States conventions and things like that, but there are no minority rights. Uh, and that's the reality. We talk about, you did talk about selective targeting of particular countries. And you gave a very apt example of Israel. So Professor Nanda was actually talking about the veto yielding powers. Uh, the way the human rights discourse post Second World War started was that, it was victors' justice. The victors of the Second World War wrote some of these treaties and some of these conventions and United Nations Charter. An organization starting with 50 members only now has 194 members, and there has not been, further revision of the charter and things like that. So there are a lot of, lacunae, lot of inconsistencies, lot of internal contradictions. And actually, we should not actually revere and glorify some of these things, because doctrines change, newer doctrines emerge, just like R2P emerged. But R2P also has been politically weaponized. You know, the countries that championed R2P destabilized the country on the false pretext of preventing genocide. But now, with more information available, it is very clear that the actual reason Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was killed was not to protect the population, but to prevent emergence of a new entity called United States of Africa, which would reduce the influence of imperialistic powers. If Africa became one strong nation and bargained for its minerals and its natural resources, the European powers would not have that kind of standing. So not only there is selective invocation of these doctrines by selective countries, but certain countries are being targeted, and that's the reality. And we have to understand that reality as to these are the lacunae of some of these things. Professor Nanda mentioned that all these 194 countries are the prima donnas, they have to give permission. If I'm not sure, Professor Nanda can tell how many of these international covenants and human rights treaties United States has ratified. You know, you can be a signatory, but the law of US suggests that Senate has to ratify. And most of the time, Senate refuses to ratify these conventions because United States has one dogma and one doctrine. That is the doctrine of American exceptionalism. That all these treaties and covenants lie to some lowly countries that do not have any national superego, national conscience, and they indulge in genocide and human rights violation without impunity. We don't do that. So these are not applicable to us. And that's a very, very haughty and arrogant attitude. So there is a tyranny of wielding powers in the international arena, but there's also a tyranny of majority, a brute tyranny of majority. Why Israel is singled out in United Nations General Assembly? Because you have 57 members strong group of OIC countries who target Israel every now and then. So I think the way we run these institutions is based on some kind of power. And it's the power play that comes into picture when we talk about implementing, whether selectively or whatever. And to my mind, we haven't found the most optimal way of implementing human rights worldwide. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the current arrangement as it stands. And I think as defenders of human rights, we will have to invent new paradigms and new doctrines and criticize what has been misused, weaponized, and selectively implemented. So I'll make just those comments, but I'm going to invite, because we are a very small group, so instead of using chat function, I'll invite any of the 8 participants to ask questions, make comments, but please do one by one.
Let me start just saying a couple of things. Anushree, that Adityanji is right. Human rights have been politicized, but kindly keep in mind that that frustration should not stand in the way of human rights as an idea. It's the most powerful idea in the world. And at the present time, if you think about it, all the armies of Napoleon could not do what one single piece of paper, and that is the Declaration of the Rights of Man in Europe, that did it. One piece of paper, simply the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in their hands in South Africa, in the era of apartheid, and people simply saying, look, I've got rights. These are my rights. You can't take away from me. And I think Adityanji again is right about Libya, but kindly keep in mind that the time that the US not in the front, it was England and it was France that took the lead in NATO. US was there. But at the time that they went in Libya, keep that at the back of your mind. Gaddafi had said, moving his armies to the east, and he said, everyone, they are rats, they are at the present time cockroaches. I am going to kill each one of them in the eastern part. And that is where at that time these people went in. That was the R2P. And obviously, we can talk a whole lot about Libya and about Syria. And it's not simply the United States. And I think the point simply is that all countries, there are very few countries that at the present time respect human rights when it comes to their own sovereignty, quote unquote sovereignty. They are pretty jealous of it. And the point simply is that in most instances, what really happens is, look, Syria, 15 resolutions, each one of those vetoed by Russia. So it's not simply one country. Unfortunately, that culture of peace, culture of human rights, it's not going to develop easily, but there is no other choice. That's the only game in town. So based upon what we have, we need to build upon it. We need to make sure that if the need is to modify, if the need is to strengthen, if the need is to change, that can be done. So kindly keep in mind that it's not all hunky-dory, but it's all not doom and gloom.
I think we have to take a balanced perspective, and in no way my criticism reflected, critique of human rights notion, but it was a critique of how it was perceived and implemented by essentially weaponizing selectively. So we have to look behind every game in the town. Nobody is actually defending either Muammar Gaddafi or Vladimir Putin, but we need to bring George W. Bush also in that category for slaughtering 500,000 Iraqi children by imposing unjust sanctions. So we have to be fair and balanced and look at every aspect, whichever country, not necessarily veto wielding. You have a non veto wielding power, Saudi Arabia, that is bombing civilian population in Yemen. We keep on blaming the Houthis and the Iranians, but nobody has raised a finger at Saudi Arabia. Again, in the international law, from time immemorial, the only universal law is might is right. And I think we have to change that notion. And for changing that notion, we need a strong spine, and we need to be able to criticize powers that be and be able to objectively analyze whose contribution is what while defending the notion of universal human rights. So that is what I would say. But let's keep an open discussion, and let's invite, maybe I'll invite Professor Pathak to give his comments.
Professor Nanda.
Let me unmute myself.
Harilalji was speaking.
Yes, I have a kind of a question, or I would like to ask the opinion of Professor Nanda. Anushree mentioned about East Timor, and I have been observing East Timor and South Sudan, how those two different countries were generated or the form. And the twist in this human right is religious conversion. East Timor is Timor itself is such a small island of Indonesia, where these Christian missionaries went and took half of the island and converted to Christianity, and then they started fighting with local Muslims, and eventually New Zealand and Australia on behalf of United Nations sends the army and form a new country. Sudan is the same kind of a story, where South Sudan, where missionaries heavily worked on it, converted them to Christianity, and then finally through United Nations they had election and made two different countries. Now, missionaries are very active all over the world, and I personally feel the human right in United Nations should stop all the missionary, doesn't matter which religion it is, to convert anybody from any religion to any other religion. That is not a freedom of religion. This is a forced conversion or deceptive way of conversion. And since you are in this field, I would like to have you take a point in United Nations that all missionaries or any religious people of any kind cannot convert anybody else unless people willingly want to change. That is up to them, but not through any kind of a planned way of doing it. I would like to
You're
hear-
absolutely right. There should be informed consent. The only trouble about the human rights issue is that at the present time, the focus of human rights has been simply on civil and political rights. And those civil and political rights also, where the focus had been from the very beginning, was based upon what happened in the Second World War. It was Germany, it was Italy, and all those countries that had violated rights of their own people. So human rights movement, excuse me, was simply to make sure that the country's government, their governments do not violate civil and political rights of their own people. And I think you can probably argue that it's a civil and political right also not to be converted without informed consent. And I think you're absolutely right. I don't think I need to go any further. We can talk later offline, but I think I would probably let other questions and comments on it.
So, Harilalji, you raised a very valid point, and at some point in time in our seminar series, we do have a topic on this particular issue. As I was saying, that new doctrines and new paradigms emerge, and old paradigms are questioned. So, this right to convert indigenous people or people who are practicing certain faith by fraud or deception, is it a human right or it's a violation of human rights? We'll be probably discussing in a much more detailed seminar. And I think these are the kind of issues we want to bring forth to discussion. I had invited Professor Pathak, so let's invite Professor Pathak for his comments.
Thank you very much. And it was a wonderful presentation by Anushree, and I appreciate that. I just have a question, or you can tell us more about it. That do you think the present concept of human rights, which has been launched and you all discussed various declarations and all those things, what type of impact all these declarations carry because of uh, their background, their religious backgrounds and their cultural backgrounds, and at the end of the day, whether there need to be updating these thought processes so that the total humanity can be considered as part of the human rights, and also human being in totality. So do you think there is a need for modifying the concept of human rights which have been propagated in last close to 100 years now, or probably 80 years?
Anushree, can you unmute yourself, please? You are on mute.
Yashwantji. That is quite a tough question, Yashwantji. I will try my level best to first of all process this question and see what thoughts I can gather about it. Based on my understanding, Yashwantji, the very concept of human rights as it is defined in the international parlance, it is somehow heavily influenced by the Western understanding of the notion of human rights. And when I say Western, I mean the powerful countries in the geopolitical arena. Obviously, as their understanding of human rights has evolved, so we see that being reflected into various covenants or the various dimensions of human rights movements across the world. Uh, as Adityanji correctly pointed out, that even if that United Nations Declaration of Independence ostensibly appears to be fundamentally speaking about human rights, but the wording itself states about men only. It clearly excludes women. With passage of time, women were considered to be part of larger human race with universal women's suffrage in 1929, etc. But still, there are certain issues which are still contested in the Western world and are not equally or proportionately reflected in the larger concept of human rights. Uh, Professor Vedananda ji pointed out the concept of environmental consciousness as essentially interwoven with human rights. Now, I believe, say for example, in the Indian Constitution itself, under Article 21, which speaks about a right to life, the right to healthy environment, right to unpolluted air, right to potable water, that is something which is already included, which was some kind of interpretation of Supreme Court under one specific case. Point being, the international community has woken up to this realization of human rights concept just a few months ago. So obviously there is, in my opinion, a need not just to update the thought process, but also to involve as many Eastern players, if I may say, as possible, and not just players from different ethnicities or from what they call the global South. Within these blocks also, there are numerous cultural traditions. If those ancient voices are also taken into consideration, which have always propounded human right without exceptionally speaking about it, because it is something which is rather an inherent part of the traditional way of life. If those voices are incorporated by the global community, then possibly we might have a more realistic and comprehensive understanding of human rights. This is what I can think right now.
I'm not going to speak too much. I shouldn't. But Pataki, the problem change is there. Declarations, guidelines, principles, they are not binding. All countries have got to do them only voluntarily. The only thing binding is a treaty. And a treaty also that has been ratified, not simply signed. And once that obligation is taken, then the point simply is going to be that treaty is binding. And again, problem is how do you interpret it? Are there any reservations? Are there any declarations? So I'm going to stop here. But the point simply is that you're right, that at the present time, it's a very imperfect and inadequate system. But that is the only game in town. There was nothing until then. After the Second World War, it became. So I'm going to shut up, but I think we have got Carl Clemens, we've got other people. Let them at least have a say before we stop today.
Before I invite our executive director and our other fellow, we have a guest who is listening to us patiently. And I think that guest has a personal lived experience of human rights violations from a minority perspective. And the guest is Dr. Raghunath Kochar, who is an Afghan Hindu who was forced to leave Afghanistan. So, Dr. Kochar, if you want to make any comments or ask any question, please go ahead. And I appreciate you joining our seminar series. Dr. Kochar?
He stepped away.
I guess he is not available. So, Carl, please go ahead, your comments and observations.
Thank you, Professor Nanda and Anushree, for your presentations. I just had a question for Anushree and also for Professor Nanda. Anushree, you've worked on you've researched the impact of social media on creating violence in society. What about the impact of social media on protecting human rights? Because, without depending on media or, state organizations or big corporations that are, susceptible to being compromised, all of a sudden on social media, something happens in my locality. I put that on social media with video or whatever. And people are talking about it now. Like, we're seeing several instances of it all over the world, different countries. Has there been any study on the impact of social media on improving human rights or kind of shining the light on human rights abuses in parts of the world where these were not highlighted before?
Thank you, Kalji, for your question. Kalji, honestly, I am not aware of any such study which deals with the impact of social media on promotion or creation of awareness vis-a-vis human rights. But I would like to share a particular experience, if I am allowed to, based on my understanding or the experience that I have had in Afghanistan. So post 2009, there is spurt in Afghanistan with regard to internet connectivity. The 2G and 3G network became readily available, and larger Afghan youth, I believe up to 27% of Afghan population, even in the hinterlands, could access social media. And for a country as young as Afghanistan, having social media presence was quite an in thing for Afghan youths. So people would largely say that the very presence of Afghan Hindu and Afghan Sikh minorities, it's unfortunate that we call them minorities today, but the very fact that Afghan Hindus and Sikhs still exist, not just in Kabul, but in other parts of Afghanistan, their mandirs and gurudwaras are fully functional, and owing to their religious identity as a non-Muslim citizen in Afghanistan, they were under severe scrutiny and under severe threat. This whole phenomena actually caught wider attention of ordinary Afghan youth owing to social media. This is something which I have personally seen also, and this has been corroborated by many colleagues and friends also. I would call it, at least in the context of Afghanistan, I would call it a double-edged sword, because in a way it created a lot of awareness among ordinary Afghan Muslim Afghan youth that their Hindu and Sikh counterparts still exist. They still very much love their country, which is why they have not left that country. But on the other hand, out of sheer enthusiasm, many people might give up actual location of some mandir or some gurudwara, or actual location of some oldly, say, Afghan Hindu couple who has otherwise been leading quite a secluded life and following their traditional way of life. Because of social media, suddenly their location comes to the fore. And then unfortunately, you hear that in the span of few months, either these people were forced to leave that place, or in many unfortunate instances, I think Raghunath ji can shed more light onto that. The moment such gurudwaras or mandir come into some light, some kind of unscrupulous activity starts sprouting around these mandir. Rarely or quite rarely you find institutional terrorism activity, and that is when it is all over the news. But other than that, from certain sections of the community which is seeking for a Puritan way of Islamic life, such people who are not following what appears to be the Islamic norms of the Islamic Emirate, their mere existence become very vulnerable. So in my opinion, it's a double-edged sword in a country where rule of law is something quite secondary, not even secondary, tertiary or quaternary.
Let's hear from Professor Nanda, because social media
There are
is important.
studies, and I will send you some of them.
Okay.
Okay, there are to Mr. Clemens also, but I'll send them to you. They're both sides.
Thank you, sir.
Pros and cons.
I think Anushree gave a very appropriate answer as double-edged sword. We need sunshine. Now, traditionally, when the print media came, that gave the sunshine. And then print media became corporatized and started speaking for big guy. So social media's emergence was a wonderful breath of light, giving voice to people nobody wanted to, talk about. So in that thing, it was a positive thing. Certain things were highlighted, but social media is very precise. Your presence can be pinpointed and you can be silent. So I think that's the most appropriate answer, that it is a double-edged sword, and not just only in Afghanistan, but in other situations, probably it has
So I'll
happened.
send you some studies. It's a very
Uh,
hot topic. A lot of work has been done.
let me invite our other fellow, Ripudaman Pachori. Ripudaman, you just did last week a seminar on history of evolution, and I had to tell you not to talk about the covenants and international treaties because that was going to be covered in this seminar. What are your comments and observations?
Um, Mostly on the same lines, but when we discuss we have to rethink about how we have modeled and architected the modern human right concept. We have to include um, the moral and the ethical aspect that comes from the ancient civilizations to redefine the modern human right uh, basically laws and declarations and all. That's pretty much I would like to say. And regarding the social media also, that was very appropriate thing that she said, Anushree said about, um, I have seen this many times that there are, some traveler videos that, young guys from Pakistan went to Afghanistan and they create these videos of old couples and the gurdwaras and the temples, and then they said, oh, we should learn about these people, they are so soft and they are so good. And after a few months and so you'll hear that something has happened over there and those guys were eliminated in one way or another. um, yeah, there are other aspects also. There are other, apart from the human rights, the social media presence has to be there for other politicals and geopolitical reasons. That is a different story. I will not go into it, but um, yeah, that's pretty much from my side.
I think,
Aditya, I have an 8 o'clock, so I'm
uh,
listening to Raghunathji for a minute, but then I'll leave.
okay, there are no problems at all. Dr. Raghunath Kochar, please, if you are there, it's your turn to make comments. I saw that you raised your hand. Kindly unmute yourself, and we all are very eager to hear from you.
Very good morning. Sorry I couldn't speak because I was on morning walk.
Oh, okay.
So still I am walking. I appreciate that you people has added me with the help of Anushree, and I have a lot to explain and say about our lives of Hindus from Afghanistan. But we will organize a meeting maybe in August or September, and I again appreciate efforts of all people, especially this group, who has given me such opportunity to join and share my comments. We are victims of human rights since long time. So today we don't have time. We will discuss in August or September and request you, Doctor, especially Dr. Tanyanji, that is a meeting arranged and I will get ready to speak and share my problems and views.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Kocher. We will be working on an annual conference, so we will put on the agenda the Afghan situation. But I'm very, very delighted that you chose to join our seminars, and in future also kindly please keep on, joining our events and visit our website, etc., etc. And we will do a special event on Afghanistan.
Thanks. I hope so. I'll try to join all the meetings.
Okay. Professor Nanda, any last minute comments by you before you leave?
He's already left.
He's already left. All right. So if there is no other comment, Anushree, do you have any last minute comment? You are on mute.
No, Adityanji, no comment as such.
Okay.
In fact,
I
I have a
think,
lot to absorb and a lot more to reflect on
okay.
from my end.
And as I said that let's not, in the pursuit of learning and in pursuit of higher principles, attaining higher principles, let's not be overawed by weaponization of human rights systems. New paradigms, new doctrines are always emerging. And our role in starting this seminar program is to groom new leaders, new thought leaders who will talk about issues nobody has talked about, who will be able to find deficiencies in the discourse, human rights discourse, and try to improve it. There's continuous quality improvement in any dimension. The moment we say that we have achieved the glory, there's no further progress. So we cannot be self-complacent that, these are the treaties and these are the covenants and that's the end of it. No, it is not the end of it. And we have to see that human rights of vulnerable populations are respected, their dignity is respected, and the lacunae in the notion of human rights and the implementation of human rights is enhanced and improved for the betterment of human race. So those should be our lofty goals, rather than just patting ourselves on back that we did this in Yemen or this in Libya or this in Rwanda, or we did not do it. So the moment you lose your critical point of view, progress ceases. And we want progress in all aspects of human race, human rights, human dignity, human duties, and human responsibilities. With that comment, I'm going to end this seminar, and we'll have another seminar next Friday.
Yes.
So please join all of us. And I thank you. And I'm pretty sure our executive director, Mr. Carl Clemens, will upload this recording of the seminar, not only on our website, but also on our YouTube channel, so that everyone can benefit from it. Thank you very much indeed.